Dr. Daniel Cross Turner, and I'm Head of Programming and Outreach for the Georgetown County Library System. Welcome to the library series of online programs celebrating our state's deep and diverse food traditions, from Blue Hills to Green Sea, representing South Carolina foodways. So we'll go up towards the mountains in the corner of our state, all the way down here to the low country and coastal plain, and examining this wonderful culinary adventure and how that speaks to identity and history. So we're excited about this. We're very thrilled that South Carolina Humanities has generously funded this virtual symposium, as well as our friends of the Georgetown Library and our friends of the Waccamaw Library. Our speaker today is a wonderful foodways scholar, well known on the literature side of things, David Davis. Dr. David A. Davis is Associate Professor of English and Associate Director of the Spencer B. King Jr. Center for Southern Studies at Mercer University. Dr. Davis will teach us how to read a Southern cookbook, He will use important cookbooks in South Carolina history, the Carolina Housewife by Sarah Rutledge, and Vibration Cooking by Vertamae to show how a cookbook functions as a work of literature. Cookbooks employ rhetorical practices that establish a relationship between reader and writer and reveal illuminating details about the writer's daily life, social conditions, and values. Readers can use this information to learn more about how labor, technology, and social structures influence what we eat and how we live. Along with Dr. Tara Powell, Dr. Davis is co-editor of the scholarly collection Writing in the Kitchen, Essays on Southern Literature and Foodways from Mississippi, one of the touchstone books in the current scholarly examination of Southern foodways and literature. So here is Dr. David A. Davis, How to Read a Southern Cookbook.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Davis, and I'm an Associate Professor of English and Associate Director of the Spencer B. King Jr. Center for Southern Studies at Mercer University. And I'm very happy to be able to join you today. And we're going to have a conversation about a topic related to South Carolina foodways. I want to discuss how to read a Southern cookbook. Now, this may seem like a slightly unconventional topic because, well, most of us have experience reading cookbooks. We read cookbooks primarily to find recipes to prepare dishes. But I want to assert that we can actually do even more with a cookbook, that we can use a cookbook as a way to find stories. I think that cookbooks are, in fact, works of literature, much like novels or books of poetry, because cookbooks do tell us stories. Now, obviously, the way they tell a story is not conventional, the way a work of fiction might tell a story with a plot and characters and antagonists and dramatic tension. But I do think that cookbooks do tell us stories, and stories that are very important, and stories that make accessible some experiences that are not always so obviously available. So while the exposition of a cookbook as a story might not be conventional, it does have some of the normal characteristics of a work of literature. Let's think, for example, a cookbook does have a certain form of rhetoric. Now, we normally think of rhetoric as being the type of exchange of information that happens between two people, either in a conversation or in text. And in any act of rhetoric, there's usually a person who is the speaker and a person who is the audience, and then there's some piece of communication being shared between those two individuals. Well, in the case of a cookbook, we have a rhetorical situation. We have a person who's doing the speaking, or in this case, the writing, or perhaps in this case, even the cooking. And then we have a person who's receiving that information, the reader of the text. And then, of course, we have the act of communication itself. In the case of a cookbook, that's going to be the recipes and any other ancillary or contextualizing information that comes along with the recipe. So I think this fact that a cookbook has a certain rhetoric does give us the opportunity to think in an engaged, critical way about, well, who is the person doing the speaking and what kind of communication are they transmitting? And also perhaps to think about who the recipient of this information is. Now, in addition to being a rhetorical act, a cookbook also has a kind of a narrative. I would contend that we can read a cookbook in a way that's very similar to the way we read any other work of literature because of the stories that it tells. A recipe is, in a sense, a short story. It's a story that tells us usually how to prepare an item of food, but we don't necessarily have to read the recipe specifically because we want to prepare the dish. That's one way to read a recipe, but we can also read a recipe to understand how people lived, how people ate, what their lives were like in a certain time and place, and also as a way of vicariously participating in those people's lives. And then if we think about how an individual recipe connects to the other recipes that are related to it, or even to the historical context, or to how a particular dish has evolved over time, we see that each instance of cooking text becomes embedded in a much broader sequence of narratives. So all these acts of writing down a way to cook a dish are ways of communicating. And any way of communicating is a way of telling a story. And so what I would like for us to do for the next few minutes is to think about the stories that are being told in South Carolina cookbooks. Here you see an example of a recipe for chicken and dumplings. And in this case, the recipe comes from a particular cookbook called Vibration Cooking by Vertamae Grosve. Notice that her particular approach to writing a recipe is highly narrative. She starts without the normal list of ingredients and instructions that one might customarily expect in a cookbook, but rather she is bringing you into the story of making this dish itself. As we're going to see, this is only one of the ways in which her cookbook in particular is an example of telling stories with food. So let's think about what these stories tell us about. When we read a cookbook as a narrative, as a set of stories, then we can learn an awful lot about how people live. And that I think is probably the most important point. A cookbook is a work of literature that tells us how people live. It allows us to, well, lean over their shoulders and participate vicariously in their lives. What's really powerfully important about thinking about the cookbook as a work of literature is that these texts tend to tell us stories about how women live, particularly how laboring women live. And in the history of literature, particularly in American literature, these are stories that are often very difficult to access. A cookbook, in some cases, is one of the best illustrations of how an ordinary woman spent the bulk of her time and energy during a typical day in the course of her life. And so if we read the cookbook as a way of getting contextual clues for these important stories, we find that cookbooks are powerful forms of communication. So let's think about some of the ways that a cookbook tells us about the way people lived. One, it gives us historical context. It tells us about the conditions of that time and place. Think, for example, of the image you're seeing on the screen in front of you. This is a plantation kitchen in South Carolina. And as you can tell from the image, it probably doesn't look much like the kitchen that you cook in currently. Here, we can think about the technology of that time and place and also think about the amount of labor that goes into that work. Well, a cookbook that's situated in this time and place is going to represent things like temperature control or appliances or cooking methods in a very particular way. And the way this recipe is related tells us an awful lot about the historical context. It also tells us about the material context. What items, whether they're ingredients, whether they're cooking tools, whether they're forms of technology, are actually available to the people who are preparing the food. And the availability of those items tells us an awful lot about how these people are integrated into larger population systems. They can tell us a lot about, for example, the population density. Are we looking at food that's being prepared in a city where there's a high volume of trade, or are we looking at food that's being prepared in a more agricultural context where most of the foods that are being prepared in the kitchen are actually produced on the grounds themselves? That can be a really important and illuminating distinction to make in thinking about how a recipe is constructed. These recipes also tell us a lot about the economic context. In addition to tell us whether a person is living and cooking in a city versus a rural setting, they tell us a lot about the prevailing economic systems in a particular area. How much do people travel? What kinds of commodities are being produced? How does that influence what they eat? How does that influence how much money is available to these people to procure ingredients? How many people are being cooked for in a particular setting? Are we cooking for a large population of people or for a small group of people? And they also tell us something about the skills and trades that are available in a particular setting and situation. So if we read a cookbook carefully, we can see an enormous amount of nuance, historical context, and detailed information about how people lived. But a cookbook also tells us beyond these tangible issues an awful lot about the social context in which people live at the time in which they're preparing food. They tell us about gender roles. They tell us about economic relationships. And very importantly, in the history of Southern cookbooks, they tell us a lot about race relations and who's doing the crucial labor to prepare the food. Let me also accentuate another important form of context that we can deduce from reading a cookbook as a form of literature. We learn about the cultural context. We find out about who a group of people are, what their social and cultural influences are. Are their influences European? Are their influences African? Are their influences Native American? We found out some important information about their household structures, about their family structures, and also their community structures. So within the microcosm of a cookbook, we can glean these important stories that tell us about who these people are. And in some respects, these cookbooks tell us an awful lot about who we are. Now, I want to focus our discussion today on what we can learn from South Carolina cookbooks. So I've chosen as my primary text for a conversation two very important South Carolina cookbooks. First, the Carolina Housewife, and second, Vibration Cooking. In my opinion, these are two of the most important historical cookbooks from South Carolina. But of course, there is a wealth of important South Carolina cookbooks. Some that I think are very important would be, for example, Dory Sanders' Country Cooking. And of course, the one that you probably all received as a wedding gift, if not some other situation, Charleston Receipts. Those are valuable and important and interesting cookbooks, but I've chosen to focus on these two books that I think make a very interesting commentary on each other. One is published in the 19th century. The other is published in the 20th century. One is by a wealthy white woman. One is by a middle-class African-American woman. And they have very, very different perspectives on food and culture and living. But if we put them in conversation with each other, we find they tell us a revealing and dynamic story. So I'm going to first talk about The Carolina Housewife by Sarah Rutledge. I'm going to pause for just one moment because there is a train coming by that's going to cause commotion. My apologies for the interruption. It happens to be the case that my office is adjacent to a railroad terminus, so occasionally I have those interruptions. But back to the Carolina Housewife by Sarah Rutledge. Sarah Rutledge is a fascinating figure in American culinary history. She published her cookbook under a pseudonym as a Lady of Charleston, and the cookbook was not formally attributed to her until several decades after its publication. But we have done a little bit of archaeological research and found some important information about who Sarah Rutledge was. She was the daughter of Edward Rutledge. Edward Rutledge was a signer of the Declaration of Independence from South Carolina, who went on to be one of the earliest governors of the state of South Carolina, which situates Sarah Rutledge in one of the most powerful and influential and prosperous families in Charleston. This is actually an image of the home of her uncle John Rutledge, which I believe is today a very posh hotel on Meeting Street in Charleston. But this is one of the homes where Sarah Rutledge lived over the course of her life. After her birth, she was educated in England. She returned to South Carolina when she was a young adult, and she never married. She was a spinster daughter who lived with aunts and uncles and relatives over the course of her life. In time, she learned a great deal about managing a household and found ways to make herself useful and accommodating to her relatives who were giving her a place to live. Her cookbook was published anonymously and primarily as a source of charity, but she does have a stated mission in the cookbook. The cookbook includes a preface that says, "We call this house a home because a house is not a home, though inhabited, unless there preside over its daily meals a spirit of order and a certain knowledge of the manner in which food is to be prepared and served. We can hardly call that house and home to which a man dares not carry a friend without previous notice to his wife or daughter, for fear of finding an ill-dressed, ill-served dinner, together with the looks of dismay and intrusion." So our stated objective here is to tell people who are running a house and home how to prepare for not only the family itself, but also for visitors. In that sense, this book fits very nicely in the long history of South Carolina as a place of hospitality, but a form of hospitality that's designed particularly to inculcate or to ingratiate guests into the atmosphere of a household. Her cookbook, The Carolina Housewife, includes a large array of recipes, several hundred. And we'll notice if we look at the recipes in the cookbook that there are certain important patterns on display among the recipes. For example, there are dozens and dozens of recipes on how to make breads, particularly rice-influenced quick breads. Some of the recipes include Carolina rice and wheat bread, Ashley rice bread, Beaufort rice bread, potato and rice bread, loaf rice bread, rice oven bread, rice spider bread, rice muffins, rice cookies, rice drops, rice slapjacks, rice crumpets, rice griddles, rice johnny cakes, rice egg cakes, 2 kinds of rice waffles, 4 kinds of rice cakes, in addition to rice biscuits. We see here a strong focus on baking and, of course, a strong focus on the most prominent grain in coastal South Carolina, rice. Other clusters of recipes in the cookbook, in addition to a focus on breads, there are a number of soup dishes, there are a great number of seafood dishes, there are whole joint meat dishes, and a great deal of pastries, puddings, sauces, cakes, and preserves. So if we look at the dishes that are being described and articulated in this particular cookbook, we can think a little bit about those issues of context that matter. So the historical context is very important here. We get a sense of what kinds of foods people are eating in this time and place. The material context is also important here. If we think about the way the cookbook is situated in the preface, this is a cookbook that's designed for a household that's going to be entertaining guests. So we're going to see a good bit of travel, transmission, and commerce going on within this household. We can also think about how this cookbook represents the economic and social conditions of Low Country, South Carolina in the early 19th century, particularly the strong focus on rice. We'll talk a little bit more about rice later in this presentation, but we can already get a sense of how that grain, how that food is instrumental in constructing this narrative of South Carolina. Let's think a little bit about one of the recipes in this cookbook. So this is Sarah Rutledge's recipe for Carolina pilau. Let's think about how she describes the recipe. It is a fairly simple dish. Boil 1.5 pounds of bacon. When nearly done, throw into the pot a quart of rice, which must be first washed and gravelled. Then put in the fowls, 1 or 2 according to size, and season with pepper and salt. In serving up, which should be done as soon as possible after the fowls are cooked enough, put the rice first in the dish and the bacon and fowls upon it. And here you can see an image of what a modern preparation of this particular recipe might look like. Now let's think about the way this recipe is constructed. First of all, you'll notice that not very much about this recipe is specific. There is a particular amount of bacon involved. There is a specific amount of rice, but the procedures are not, they're not very mechanical. And even the amounts that are described here are not put into a great deal of context. We have to presume that any person who will be preparing this particular dish would be very familiar with the kitchen, would be very familiar with these ingredients. But let's also think a little bit about how this recipe represents technology. Notice that there is no statement here about exactly how hot a stove or a pot should be to prepare this particular dish. It's because this dish will be prepared over a fire hearth. And so the hearth, the size of the fire, would determine how quickly the ingredients in the dish would actually cook. So the person who's preparing this dish has to have a great deal of experience with controlling a fairly primitive cook space. I also think about the specific ingredients that are related here. These are ordinary ingredients that would have been readily available in a South Carolina kitchen: bacon, rice, chicken. And these items are prepared together. And as you can imagine, these are staple items of the South Carolina diet in the 19th century, to which we would probably add seafood and baked goods. So this dish represents how people lived and ate in a particular time and place. But there's something else that's kind of interesting about this specific recipe. It's a Carolina pilau. So a pilau is a mixed rice dish. And that particular term actually has Asian derivation. So we get a sense from this recipe of how Charleston is situated as an important port city in the 18th and 19th century, because there's going to be international commerce coming in and out of this port. And here we see a recipe that takes international inspiration, a mixed rice dish, and applies it specifically to ingredients that are readily available in the South Carolina Low Country. So this is a way that we can read this particular recipe for social, cultural, historical context and learn an awful lot about the narrative about how people live in this particular time and place. Let's think about some of the same kinds of approaches to reading Vibration Cooking by Vertamae Smart-Grosve. Vertamae Grosvenor is an absolutely fascinating person. She is originally from Fairfax, South Carolina, which would be in the lower Piedmont area. Her family are descendants of the Gullah people from the Sea Islands. The subtitle for her cookbook is Travel Notes of a Geechee Girl. So she appropriates the identity of Geechee. This is a person who's from an African-American person from the South Carolina Lowcountry. But the point about travel notes is a very important indicator in her cookbook. While she's born in South Carolina, her family migrated to Philadelphia, and she spent her young childhood in Philadelphia, where her mother worked as a domestic in a white household. Vertamae Grosvenor was fascinated with theater, and in 1959, she left the United States to travel to Paris, where she wanted to pursue a career in drama. She lived in Paris for several years, and she did act in many productions, but one of her most fascinating characters that she portrayed was as herself. She became an embodiment or an emissary of African-American identity to the people of France. Along the way, she took a number of jobs to pay the bills. Many of them involved cooking, but she also cooked frequently for friends and guests and associates that she made in Paris, where she was part of a very vibrant expatriate American and African-American community. After living in Paris for several years, she returned to the United States and she wrote her cookbook, Vibration Cooking, in the 1980s. She says she writes it primarily as a way to produce a creative document, as a way to exercise her creative muscles. But it was published and found a really exciting and receptive audience of people who were somewhat transfixed with the way that she describes her culture and her food. This led to her getting a position as a commentator on National Public Radio, where she did an audio commentary for several years, which made her very well known in many circles. But I think that it is this cookbook, Vibration Cooking, that makes her most famous. Now, her cookbook is fairly unique. While Sarah Rutledge's Carolina Housewife is a fairly typical representation of a 19th century cookbook, Vibration Cooking is unconventional in every possible sense. It's not organized by dish, rather it's organized by anecdote. And Vertamae Smart-Grosve tells stories about her life and situates the food within the story, and then situates the story in context with the food. So we end up with a really fascinating image of how the dishes that she describes are representations of who she is and her own personal experience. Let's take an example of one of her dishes. This is groundnut stew. So the recipe says, cut up and season in a saute with chicken and peanut oil. Now, before we go any further, we can already see that there is a peculiar narrative form to this recipe, somewhat similar to the way that Sarah Rutledge describes a cooking process without being specific about amounts of ingredients or procedures or temperatures. We see that Vertamae Smart-Grosve uses a similar approach in which she situates the person reading the recipe directly in the process without that contextualization. From there, she tells us when brown, when the chicken is brown, we add chopped bell pepper, without telling us how much, and chopped onions, again, without telling us how much. When the onions are transparent, we add red pepper and chicken broth and lots of chunky style peanut butter. The sauce should be on the stiff side. Serve with rice or plantains. So this recipe, similar to the recipe that we discussed just a few minutes ago, tells us something really significant about the person who's producing it. This is a person who's experienced with cooking, tells us something about what types of cooking vessels and technologies they have at their disposal. This is clearly a stovetop recipe, even though it doesn't have particular temperatures represented. But also notice how the ingredients here are of important material significance. Chicken, onions, broth, and peppers are pretty ordinary ingredients that would be available at any time and place, but notice the addition of chunky style peanut butter. This particular ingredient bridges, I think, some interesting territory between the influence or inspiration for this particular dish in West Africa and 20th century American culinary commercialism using prepared peanut butter from a grocery store. And that influence, I think, is really important in this recipe because groundnut stew is peanut stew. This is a West African dish that she's incorporating into her repertoire. And I think it's a fascinating illustration of the way that she manifests what she describes as Geechee culture. So those of us who are familiar with the history of the Gullah people of South Carolina know that they are the descendants of a community of enslaved people who worked in the rice cultures of coastal South Carolina. Their origins are in Western Africa, where groundnut stew is a commonly consumed dish. So this is a way of Vertamae Smart-Grosve appropriating African culture into African American culture in the context of the 20th century, which situates her very blatantly within an aesthetic movement that she identified with, the Black arts movement. Among the people who she was close with in Paris and in the United States are artists and intellectuals such as Amiri Baraka, Larry Neal, James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, and other people who are asserting in the late mid-20th century an Africanized African-American identity. Well, this dish is a way of doing with food the same kind of cultural appropriation and assertion that other people are doing with music or with poetry or with drama or with fashion, which situates, I think, Grosvenor in a really fascinating social and cultural milieu. I want to take this opportunity to focus on a commentary that she makes about some of the most important forms of white engagement with African-American foodways. In one section of the book, she has a heading that reads, "White Folks and Fried Chicken." And she writes, "White folks act like they would starve for sure if they couldn't have a hunk of meat. Eating neck bones don't bother me none. White folks be talking about classic, and they mean Beethoven, and French cooking. Classic to me is James Brown and soul food. If you check out the difference between what black and white folks eat, ain't no wonder they can't get along. French folks always covering up the meat with some sauce or the other. Most of the time it's to cover up the rancid taste of the meat. Poor as we was, we never ate no bad meat. My mother would take it back or throw it away before she cooked it for us. Black folks spend more money for food than white folks. White folks can take a can of tuna fish and feed multitudes. If we couldn't have meat, we had greens and rice, and we had plenty of that, but my mother never cooked none of them weird tuna casserole. We never ate cold storage chickens either. My grandmother still don't." And notice here how she begins telling a story about how her family eats. She makes distinctions between racial identities, and she very proudly asserts the racial identity that she learned growing up in South Carolina and among Gullah people. She goes on to give a couple of different variations on chicken recipes, but for the most part, she shies away from giving highly illustrative fried chicken recipes. She rarely takes us through the steps and sequences and amounts and procedures of a particular dish. This is consistent with what she describes as vibration cooking. In her opinion, cooking is almost an improvisational process. And so what she's providing here is inspirational instructions, and she expects the person who's doing the work themselves to participate. That's a really profound way of shifting the rhetoric of a cookbook. I talked before about the rhetoric of a recipe that has a person who's writing the recipe, a person who's reading the recipe, and the recipe is an act of communication. Well, in Vertamae Smart-Grosvenor's case, she's assuming that the person who's reading the recipe is going to offer their own improvisations on the dish itself. And so she allows the space for that kind of improvisation, that kind of vibrational cooking to take place. So in reading these Southern cookbooks, we can begin to make, I think, some really interesting comparisons between the two texts themselves, between Sarah Rutledge's cookbook and Vertamae Smart-Grosve's cookbook. So in both of these cookbooks, we see cooking as a form of labor. In Vertamae Smart-Grosve's cookbook, she talks primarily about herself as a cook, but she also talks about her family members and her friends as cooks. And she talks about using the food as a kind of a social engagement that builds those family and communal relationships. For example, here you see her recipe for red rice. And she gives a minimalist interpretation of how to prepare red rice, but then she begins talking about her Aunt Rose. Her Aunt Rose is a person who prepared red rice as a dish that she shared with members of her family. It's a very different context in the case of Sarah Rutledge's cookbook, where she talks about who does the cooking of the particular dishes in the cookbook. We'll notice, for example, as we read the recipes in Sarah Rutledge's cookbook, that they are very labor intensive. Preparing these dishes is a great deal of work. And she does give us a clue about who's actually doing the work of preparing these recipes. She says that French or English cookery books are to be found in every bookstore. But these are for French or English servants, and almost always require an apparatus either beyond our reach or too complicated for our native cooks. The Carolina Housewife will contain primarily receipts for dishes that have been made in our own homes and with no more elaborate abattoir de cuisine than that belonging to families of moderate income, even those dishes lately introduced to us to have been made successful by our own cooks. We can do a little bit of deductive reasoning here about who Sarah Rutledge has in mind when she says our native cooks. Sarah Rutledge comes from a prosperous, powerful family of Charleston planters. Most of the labor that's being employed to produce the dishes that she describes in her cookbook is actually going to be the labor of enslaved women. And she designs a cookbook that could be used by a white plantation mistress as a guidebook for enslaved, most likely illiterate African-American women who do the work of cooking in the household. So a cookbook such as this is not just a collection of recipes, it's also a reflection of the culture of slavery in the Low Country. Therefore, it's an extremely powerful and illuminating historical document to not just how the white planter family lived, but also the living and labor conditions of the people who are enslaved and working to provide for the white planter family. So the cookbook tells us about labor. The cookbook tells us about family. The cookbook tells us about community. And I also want to highlight that the cookbook tells us specifically about women. In the case of Sarah Rutledge's cookbook, the title is The Carolina Housewife. And this is one of a few housewife cookbooks that were produced in the early 19th century, such as the Virginia Housewife or the Kentucky Housewife. These books tell us a lot about how women lived, their living conditions, their laboring conditions, and the expectations of women's roles in the early 19th century. Vertamae Smart-Grosve's Vibration Cooking, on the other hand, tells us the story of a liberated African-American woman who is transgressive and creative and artful, and who has bohemian relationships with numerous groups of people. But both of these cookbooks tell us important, difficult to access stories about how women live. And therefore, it's important, I think, to think of the cookbook as an illustration of a social context, but most particularly stories about gender, stories about women, stories about the lives of women who are often overlooked in the broader historical record. Now, Before I conclude, I want to talk about a very obvious issue in the context of South Carolina cookbooks. I want to talk about the importance of rice. Beyond the Carolina pilau and the red rice recipe, I want to think a little bit more broadly about the importance of rice in the history of South Carolina food. Of course, historically, rice was one of the most crucial economic commodities in South Carolina history. Rice has been produced in the South Carolina Low Country for centuries, but the production of rice made plantation slavery profitable in Low Country South Carolina before it was profitable in some other parts of what eventually became the United States. Thus, Charleston became a major port both of the importation of slaves and also the exportation of rice, which was one of the most profitable commodities in colonial era America. This particular commodity thus brings together several cultural forms that are distinctive to Low Country South Carolina. The culture of rice itself, the culture of the planters who owned the plantations and sold the rice, and the culture of the kidnapped Africans who were sold into slavery and did the work of producing rice on the plantations. Both of these cookbooks demonstrate that rice is absolutely crucial to the history of South Carolina foodways. And I'd like to talk for just one moment about how both of these texts represent the preparation of rice. So Sarah Rutledge talks about how to prepare and boil rice. To prepare and boil rice, wash and gravel 1 pint of rice, add it to 1/4 pint of water, and a tablespoonful of common salt. Boil over a quick fire for 10 minutes, stirring occasionally, then pouring off all or nearly all of the water. Cover the vessel and put it on a very slow fire and allow it to steam for 15 minutes at least, stirring occasionally. The proper washing and graveling method are important. She goes on to describe the washing method and the graveling method. So one of the key takeaways from the recipe here is that rice preparation is going to be very labor intensive. We might also notice that the rice preparation method here is somewhat distinct in the sense that this rice is boiled, then drained, and steamed. I think that's a rather distinctive way of producing rice in the South Carolina Low Country, particularly the golden grain rice that we call Carolina Gold. We'll know, of course, that most Asian cultures wouldn't drain off rice. They would actually steam the rice in a small amount of water directly in the pot. So this is a very distinctive way of preparing rice. And it's also important that Sarah Rutledge foregrounds this particular recipe and method earlier in her cookbook because it's going to be crucial to understanding many of the other recipes in the cookbook itself. Vertamae Smart-Grosve does something very similar. Actually, before the first formal section of the cookbook, there is a small heading that says Hoppin' John. And she talks about what to her is one of the most crucial dishes of South Carolina food, Hoppin' John. And here's her entire recipe. 4 lines. First, cook black-eyed peas. Second, when they are almost done, add rice. Third, mix rice and peas together. Fourth, season, and voila, you got it. For her, this is the entire recipe. This is the first recipe in the cookbook. And so this tells us an awful lot about the recipes that we're going to encounter here. There's not a great deal of methodology described in this cookbook. It's expected that the person reading the cookbook would know how to cook. And more importantly, I think it's expected that the person who's reading these recipes wants to participate vicariously in this kind of culture. But she has more to say about the importance of rice. And speaking of rice, I was 16 years old before I knew that everyone didn't eat rice every day. Us being Geechees, we had rice every day. When you said what you were eating for dinner, you always assumed that rice was there. That was one of my jobs too, to cook the rice. A source of pride to me was that I cooked rice like a grown person. I could cook it till every grain stood by itself. What you do is rub it together with the palms of your hands and make sure you get all the grains washed. Then you put it in a pot with cold water. I use 1 part rice to 2 parts water. Always use cold water. Let it come to a boil and cover it with a tight cover. As soon as it comes to a boil, you turn it to a simmer, and then you cover it with a tight cover. Let it cook for exactly 13 minutes, and then cut it off. Let it stand for 12 minutes before eating. Well, notice that she gives us a very detailed method for cooking rice, which shows us something additionally significant about the importance of rice in the South Carolina diet. This is a connection to Vertamae Smart-Grosve that goes all the way back to her ancestors who had been kidnapped into slavery. This is a connection from Vertamae Smart-Grosve also to the planter culture of 18th and 19th century South Carolina that Sarah Rutledge represents. This is a nexus that brings together a great deal of the history of South Carolina. And one of the ways in which we can see that Foodways is highly illustrative of who we are historically and culturally as a people. So this, I think, is an illustrative overview of how we can read a cookbook as a form of literature. A cookbook is a text. A cookbook is a rhetorical act. A cookbook is a narrative. A cookbook is a way in which we represent not only the sharing of food to build our personal, our familial, and our communal bonds, but it's a way of also sharing the stories about who we eat, who we are, and how we understand each other. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about how to read a cookbook as a work of literature. I hope you have a very good day.